and climate change. And we invite you to check out both groups, the Friends of Blackwater and the Center on Climate Change, on the internet and on Facebook. It's really exciting that this live program has more than 200 registrants, and I see now 76 participants from all kinds of different locations. Welcome, everyone. We appreciate your being here, and we appreciate your concern for these important issues. And we appreciate the Appalachian Stewardship Foundation and the donors to Friends of Blackwater who financially make this possible. Now I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and I'll make it short. We're honored to have Dr. William Moomaw as our first presenter today. Dr. Moomaw graduated from Williams College, where he earned a PhD in earned a PhD in physical chemistry from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is Professor Emeritus of International Environmental Policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and he has been a lead author for several intergovernmental panel on climate change reports. His 2019 paper, co-authored with Susan A. Massino and Edward A. Faison, is entitled Intact Forests in the United States. Proforestation mitigates climate change and serves the greatest good. It's published in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change. Our second presenter, Dr. Sam Davis, who prefers the pronoun they, earned a BS in biology summa cum laude at Damon College and a PhD in environmental science at Wright State University with postdoctoral work at the University of California, Merced. Dr. Davis's research has examined the impacts of human activity on a rare butterfly, Pieris virginiensis, which I believe is also called the West Virginia white butterfly. And I think that work alone could qualify Dr. Davis as an honorary West Virginian. Dr. Davis was a principal researcher for the Great American Stand, a new report by the Dogwood Alliance that examines forest management opportunities for combating the climate crisis in the United States. They serve on the board of the Inclusive Ecology section at the Ecological Society of America. Thank you, Sam Davis, for joining us today. Brittany Patterson of West Virginia Public Broadcasting will be asking our two speakers a few questions after they both speak. Our webmaster and MC, Colin Madison of Friends of Blackwater, will collect any questions and comments that the audience submits through the Zoom chat feature and give them to our speakers to respond to after Brittany's questions. Again, thanks everyone very much for joining us. Take it away, Colin.
All right, well, first up, I believe we have Dr. Moomaw, is that right?
Yes, I think that's the plan.
All right, perfect. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and spotlight your video, sir, and then you're welcome to share your screen and get started whenever you want.
All right, let me share screen and then do slideshow from the beginning. Start. Okay. Well, Tom and Colin, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. And even after we had to postpone because of the coronavirus, made alternative plans. This is actually, I would prefer to actually be in Morgantown personally, but we just can't do that. And I'm also pleased to be on this program with Sam Davis, with whom I worked previously in putting together the Great American Stand report that came out, what was that, 2017, I think, Sam, if that's right. Yes. What I want to do is to talk to you a bit about a role of trees that doesn't get as much attention as other things, which is their role in addressing climate change. And let me just get started on that and we'll go through it. You're very fortunate in West Virginia to have the Monongahela National Forest. It looks like a beautiful place. I've only been in a corner of it once, and it really is quite spectacular. Here we see a backpacker going through it. It's really in the eastern United States, it's part of the real wilderness that we are fortunate to have that runs up through the Great Smokies, all the way through West Virginia, all the way up to the Canadian border, and right through where I am right now, which is in the very northwest corner of Massachusetts, right on the Vermont border. The Monongahela is a remarkable forest that is part of the was part of the establishment of Eastern National Forest. I'm actually on my back boundary of my property borders the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, which is another one of those forests. And we know that forests provide all of these services, and the forest products, wood, fiber, fuel, we know about that. Often that's what dominates forest use, but I'm going to suggest there are other things that are as important, or I think in one case, one or two cases, even more important. Forests help protect our water quality, the quantity, flood control. They provide hydropower. People point out that forests protect the largest amount of biological diversity. That's actually backwards. It isn't a forest if it isn't biologically diverse. It's just a stand of trees. That's not a forest, but a biologically diverse ecosystem that has trees on it is a forest. Forests provide something like a quarter of the oxygen supply that we breathe. They forest, because of evapotranspiration, the evaporation of water from the leaves, they moderate temperatures, which during this time of global warming is really important. And forests, because of the, well, I guess the simplistic way to call it is the composting of leaves and needles creates organic soil. And of course, because trees do transpire water and evaporate it from the leaves, and the roots hold soil, it prevents flooding and erosion control. Forests provide recreation, and I might also add, I'm working with a colleague who is a neuroscientist, and she has demonstrated that when we go for a walk in the forest, it actually changes our brain chemistry. And the reason you feel so good is because your brain chemistry has changed and you're much less tense and so forth than you were before. And forests, of course, have cultural, aesthetic, and religious values for many people. And then the topic I'm going to be talking about is climate mitigation through carbon dioxide accumulation in forest, and the resiliency to a changed climate that forests provide. So let me jump right in. Last November, 4 colleagues and I published this paper, and we had sent out some notices ahead of time. And by the time we published it on November the 4th, I think it was, or 5th, November 5th, 11,000 scientists had signed on to this paper. It's very short. It's easy to find. Just put in 11,000 scientists, climate emergency, bioscience, and up it will come. And in it, we have 29 different little graphs showing what's causing climate change and what the consequences are. And then we have 6 different things that we might do. And the 2 that are most relevant to what I'm talking about here today is that we need to remove forests in particular, or need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at the same time that we reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, because carbon dioxide, as you all know, is a heat trapping gas that absorbs the radiant heat from the earth, re-radiates half of it out to space and half of it back to earth. And the remarkable thing is that even on a sunny day, there is more than twice as much radiation warmth coming from the atmosphere, from the trapped heat that's in it, than you're getting directly from the sun on that day. Of course, if the sun stopped shining, that would stop too, but it's really quite remarkable. Now, every year in November or December, the governments of the world meet somewhere and talk about what they're going to do about climate change, and there are international treaties that are involved. And the U.S. has announced that a year from November, November 4th, the United States will withdraw from what's called the Paris Agreement, which which means we won't be playing, at least officially playing our role. And that happens to be just, I think it's a day after election day, so it'll still go through, but who knows what the outcome will be. This was just a sign that was at this meeting. I was at this meeting. It was supposed to be in Santiago, Chile, but they were having riots and things and a lot of social disturbances. So they said, we can't do it. And so the Prime Minister of Spain said, well, bring it here. You still run it, Chilean government, but we will hold it here in Madrid. So that's where it was. And this was just one of the many signs that were posted around there. TikTok, don't call it change, call it climate emergency. And that was, of course, the title of our paper. They didn't do it because we wrote the paper with that title, but it's interesting that we converged on the same word. By the way, we call it an emergency rather than a crisis, because when you call something a crisis, it's hopeless. When you call it an emergency, it suggests that we could do something to prevent it, or we can be right on top of it and respond immediately. And we thought that was a more appropriate and realistic thing to do. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an international organization that the US is still a member of, and has put out many reports since it started in, well, the first one came out in 1990. And this report came out in 2018. It was called the Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason for that is that at the Paris Agreement, every government in the world, including the US, agreed that we should try to keep the temperature of the world from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius if we possibly can. And if we can't do that, we should definitely keep it below 2 degrees. So government said, well, what do we have to do to stay below 1.5 degrees temperature rise? And this is a quotation from that report. To keep temperatures from rising excessively, that's my paraphrase, but the quote is, global net anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions must decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero around 2050. Now, what does all this net stuff mean? It means basically that we must not be putting it in faster than nature can take it out by 2050. And in between this time, it's just the increases have to be decreased by 45% by 2030. So we have to simultaneously reduce our emissions and accumulate more atmospheric carbon in forests. So how do we know how to reduce emissions? And we just, we shift away. We start using more solar energy and wind energy, and we use energy more efficiently to provide the same services. And but how do we accumulate more carbon on land by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? This is from a paper that's published in some form or another every year by a group of about 50 scientists who keep track of where the carbon goes in the world. And it looks complicated, but I've tried to simplify it for you by circling a few things. Every year, we're putting in about 9.4 billion tons of carbon from fossil fuels. That's the arrow on the left. And the orange arrow of 1.5 billion tons is what we put in by change, they call it land use change. It's mostly deforestation, and including the conversion of forest land to either agricultural land or to urban land. So the total is 10.9. That's what we're putting in every year. Just remember the number 10.9. The remarkable thing is the increase in the atmosphere isn't 10.9, it's 4.7. What's happening? Where is it going? And it turns out that it's going in two places. On land, it's going about 3.2 plus another 0.6, so we don't know quite where it's going on land, but somewhere, so say about 3.8 is going into vegetation on land. Plants absorb carbon dioxide in the presence of water, and the energy from the sun converted into cellulose fiber, which is basically becomes wood fiber when it's in a forest. Another 2.4 billion tons is going into the ocean. That's not so good because it's making the ocean more acidic. You dissolve carbon dioxide in water and it makes it more acidic. So we'd prefer not to be doing that, but we don't have any control over that. But what we do have control over is wood. It is the amount that's going into forests in particular, but also wetlands and elsewhere. So here's what we need to do, and I'll just go through these steps rather quickly, and then we'll go and see sort of where things stand with forests like the Monongahela and others. So we need to replace the burning of fossil fuels and wood for energy with zero carbon sources like wind and solar. And the reason I have wood in there, burning wood in there, which a lot of people do, and I know it's a necessity for many people, but I'm really talking here about the industrialized use of wood to make heat and electricity. Burning wood produces more carbon dioxide per unit of heat or electricity than coal. That's often a shock to people. I mean, here in New England, we've all been, you know, it's I don't know, we call it a romantic notion going back to colonial days. Being able to have a fireplace, it's just part of the culture. And that's, in Massachusetts, I think something like 5% of households are heated by wood. And in some cases, it's a necessity financially. In other cases, it's a cultural choice. But what is happening increasingly is people are replacing fossil fuels with wood to make electricity and calling it carbon neutral because trees will grow to replace it. And that turns out not to be a valid assessment. So we need to do something about reducing all those emissions. We need to also reduce emissions from the conversion of forest lands and wetlands and grasslands into urban, industrial, and agricultural uses. We need to protect our older forests to keep carbon out of the atmosphere, and you'll see why that's important in a moment. And then we need to practice proforestation, which is a term that we developed in this paper we published last year, which is to grow younger forests to meet their ecological potential to accumulate carbon in trees and soils. I'll explain that in more detail in just a moment. And finally, we need to restore degraded forests and reforest harvested areas. So that's kind of the priority list. We stop emitting, we reduce emissions from conversion, we protect older forests, we let existing forests grow, more existing forests grow, and we restore degraded forest and reforest. So here's the basis for all of these recommendations. In 2018, Erb and a bunch of people in Germany published this paper where they did a lot of analysis and discovered that existing forests and grasslands can store twice as much atmospheric carbon as they currently do. That's an astounding finding. In other words, we have managed our lands and forests and wetlands to reduce the storage by half. Soils and wetlands can also sequester substantially more carbon dioxide than they currently do. And I've been working with a group of wetland scientists as well as a group of forest scientists to work out all of these carbon storage potential and opportunities. And then one of those colleagues, Dr. Beverly Law, who's actually at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, sums it all up in this very succinct statement. This is so simple, but so profound. Carbon in forests and soils is carbon not in the atmosphere. And that's the point we need to keep in mind. Wherever we can put carbon that's not in the atmosphere is going to help us with the climate. Another paper that came out in 2018 was by a group out at Utah State University by Lutz and his colleagues. And they surveyed 48 different kinds of forests around the world, temperate forests, boreal forests, tropical forests, and they found that the largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprised 50% of forest biomass worldwide. Carbon in trees is roughly half of the weight of the wood. Half of the weight of the wood is carbon. So you see a big tree that's twice as big as another one, it has twice the carbon in it. And what they found out with all these forests is about half of it is in the biggest 1% of trees. 1 out of every 100 trees in the forest had half the carbon in it on that piece of land. And then a group in New England, Keaton, who's up at the University of Vermont, found that New England forests can store, these are the temperate forests that we have here, can store between 2.4 and 4.3 times the current amounts. So we are underutilizing our forests for carbon accumulation. Now, we all know that planting trees is good. And by the way, on the left is this photo of the forest that's about 20 miles from my home here in Massachusetts. And the man standing next to that magnificent tree is Bob Leverett, who founded an organization of people who locate all of the old forest remnants in certainly in the eastern half of the United States, including in West Virginia and up here. And then they go out and measure them. And he has the most sophisticated laser tools to do this. And I went out with him and we discovered some remarkable things about some of these big trees. So planting trees is good, we all know that, but letting them grow is better. And what we call proforestation management, to distinguish it from reforestation or afforestation, proforestation management allows some of our secondary forests to reach their biological potential for carbon accumulation in trees and soils. And in older forests, often more than half of the carbon on an acre is in the soils, not just in the standing trees. And finally, the larger, older trees in their prime growth period accumulate more carbon in the wood of their trunks and limbs than do so-called fast-growing young trees. So there's some foresters who are saying, well, we ought to cut this big tree right here down because it's really not storing much more carbon. And you see the little red arrows up there. The other little red arrow is pointing to a little skinny tree next to it. You can see there's a lot more carbon in the big one than in the smaller one. And if we were to cut the bigger one down to put another couple of smaller ones in its place, this forest would never catch up with the accumulated carbon that it has right now, ever again. It just it could never get there. So here's something based on some work that Bob Leverett and I did. This is for a white pine in the eastern northeast US. We could do the same thing in West Virginia, to see how carbon accumulates in a stand of trees. So the unit here is tons per acre, and we're doing this with trees that are 50, 100, and 150 years. So let's say we had some trees that had grown for 50 years, and that, if they're white pines, that would have about 22 tons of carbon in an acre. Now, if we were to cut it and turn it into products, or cut it and burn it for energy, and then regrew it as a sustainable forestry, we'd be back in 50 years to 22 tons. On the other hand, if we let it continue growing, it would be 47 tons. Now let's repeat that for a second cycle. Now we do a threefold. We do two cuttings and sustainable regrowth. In 150 years, we're back to where we were at 50 years. If we let it grow, it would have been almost 76 tons. Huge difference in the amount that gets accumulated in the forest if you let it grow. And that's why we talk about proforestation is this process. It's letting our younger and secondary forests grow, enough of them grow that we can store enough carbon to help us meet that goal of being zero net carbon by 2050. So here's just an example in West Virginia. This is restoring the Lambert Run strip coal mine, which is, I think it was bought by the US Forest Service, so it may be adjacent to the Monongahela. I'm just not sure of that. I tried to find it online to see where it was, but I know it must be close because the Forest Service bought it. And you can see it's going to take a very long time. And this is a great thing to do, by the way, but it's going to take a very long time before the forest here is restored to a status where it's storing much carbon. And another person from Oregon State College of Forestry, Mark Harmon, way back in 1990 pointed out that the carbon storage in an old forest versus forest with a 60-year sustainable harvest cycle is quite different. So for example, the green spike at the left is what the forest was, how much carbon was stored at the top. This is schematic here, obviously. And then it's cut, and that drops dramatically. And then it regrows for 60 years, and then it's cut again. That's why the sawtooth thing. And then it grows another 60 years and so forth. And this difference is the difference in the average. The red line is kind of the average amount of carbon that's in the forest, and divides it between what's in the forest and what is in the atmosphere, which is everything that's in the gray area. So if you were to allow it to grow back, it would take about 200 years, this is for the Pacific Northwest, for it to return to what it was 200 years before. So the important point is that sustainable forestry is an important thing to do, but it only talks about not cutting more on average than you have, then it will regrow in the time period that you're managing it. It says nothing about how much is in the forest. It's like saying I have a bank account, I put $100 in every month, I take $100 out. My bank account is stable, but there's a big difference whether inside that bank account there's $100 or $1,000, right? And obviously having $1,000 that bank account's a whole lot better than having $100. So that's the idea that we're working with here. So just to give some examples roughly, this is actually again from the Pacific Northwest, because that's where a lot of work on this has been done. In an old forest, this is looking at, it's in kilograms of carbon per square meter of forest, which are square meters are a little bigger than a square yard. You get in an old forest of living trees about 12.7, and a kilogram is 2.2 pounds, so double that roughly. So 25 pounds of biomass and about 3 pounds in the trees in a young forest. Little shrubs and things, very little in an old forest, 0.3 or about 0.6 of a pound in the young forest. The dead logs are there showing there's a difference there. The litter, which means just the branches and things that fall. And then the soils, you can see there's more carbon in the soils in an older forest than in a younger forest. And how are we doing in the world? Well, not very well. The dark green is the original forest, and the light green is basically our secondary forest, at least as they were about 8,000 years ago. If you look at that whole area enclosed by the light green, including the dark green, that's what was there 8,000 years ago when we began agriculture. And the dark green is what we have left today. So not a lot left. And you notice in the 48 states, there's a little bit out in the Pacific Northwest, a tiny, tiny few speckles in the eastern part of the country, and that's it. Here's another representation. This is looking at forest disturbance. The more purple it is, the more the forest is disturbed. And we know that the Amazon is really bad, and there's a lot of deforestation there. But look at Europe. This is basically all just tree farms. There is really no forest there. It's just tree farms that are sustainably harvested. But look at this. The most disturbed place on the planet is in North America, in the United States, and it's in the Southeast United States. And Dr. Davis will talk a bit about that. Let's look at our Northeast region. This is a map put out by the U.S. Forest Service. Sadly, in 2018, they took it down. It's off the web now. Fortunately, I had saved it, and it's only for 2010. It'd be nice if they'd updated it. And it comes in colors. And the dark green, they use metric tons per hectare. I've translated that into tons per acre, those numbers. 58 tons per acre is the dark green, 18 tons per acre is the bright pink. And you'll notice here in West Virginia, there is an area that's dark green, pretty good sized area. And if you notice, and by the way, you can also see there are dark green areas where I am up there in Western New England. And in Upper New York State, that is the largest uncut area in the Northeast, in this region, and a few other places. But look at Maine. It's only 18 So it's less than 1/3 the carbon density, the number of tons of carbon per acre. And that's because it's been managed so intensely, first for pulp and paper, and now they're trying to manage it for bioenergy, for burning wood in place of burning coal. And it has just devastated the forests up there. So, so bioenergy is not a solution for carbon storage, for replacing fossil fuels. It puts out as much carbon and it reduces the uptake of carbon dioxide because you just have a much younger forest that doesn't take up much carbon for a long time. Now, where is carbon stored in forest and wood products? There's a lot of talk about we're going to build high-rise buildings with cross-laminated timber, and we're trying to create markets for more forest products. And again, working with this group out in the Pacific Northwest, they have data showing since the beginning of the forestry industry in 1900 in Oregon, how much carbon was in that original forest, how much of it was harvested, and where is that carbon today? And it turns out that just 20% of the original carbon that was harvested beginning in 1900 continuously through 2015, just 20% of the original carbon is in long-lived wooden products. 20% is in landfills, and 60% is in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. That's a stunning finding. In other words, we have this huge legacy of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from all the forestry we've done. And it's estimated by Mark Harmon that the advantage of carbon storage in wood products is often overestimated between a factor of 2 and 100-fold compared to alternatives. So one thing that would help, and we are going to keep using forest products, I'm not saying we won't use them. The question is there a better way to manage so that what we use for harvested timber does not interfere with the forests that we need to accumulate more carbon? But longer harvest cycles do help. And reducing the use of single-use paper products would help. If we made all of our paper products that are disposable from the parts of trees that can't be utilized for timber, that would be a much better thing to do rather than going to the Canadian North and cutting down 400-year-old trees to make paper towels, Kleenex, and toilet paper. Here's what happens, and this is really shocking to me. This paper by Harris in 2016 found that the annual forest carbon loss every year in the United States, this is from about 2013 or something, I forget the exact year, but about that time, this paper was published in 2016, that fully 85% of all the emissions are from harvesting. That's the biogenic emissions. That is because when you cut down a tree and use it for timber, somewhere between 40 and 60% of it is not useful for making boards. It's particularly, I mean, pines and things that are straight, it's better than that. It's at the 60% is used. If you look at oaks, there's an awful lot of the wood that's in the branches, which you can't make into boards. And this includes insect damage, fires, wind loss, drought, and land conversion. All of that together is 15%. And when I looked at those numbers, I found that it adds up to about 160 million metric tons of carbon per year. And that exceeds the total amount of fossil fuel emissions from heating, commercial, and residential buildings in the United States. And that does not count the fossil fuel used in the machinery and the transportation and everything and the milling and everything for the wood. Here's another paper that really lays it out, that sustainable harvesting for wood products is not a solution if you want to do it, if you're going to claim it for a solution. There is more carbon released from harvesting than there is that's stored in the wood products. And so the red line here is a forest with no management beginning in 2005 and going out 150 years. That's the red line at the top. And then there are all kinds of clear cuts and shelter cuts and all kinds of different ways of managing forests. And none of them over that 150-year period come close to this. And this, by the way, these numbers all include what is stored in wood products. So it's both what's in the forest and what's in the wood products. And then this just shows it in a bar graph format. Here are all the different ways of managing. And this is the above ground biomass. This is the standing dead wood that's in the forest. This is the coarse woody debris that's lying on the forest floor, and the carbon that's stored in wood products is this amount. This is what you get if you do proforestation. If you let the forest grow, you get a lot more carbon stored than you do in any of these combined, and this includes what's in the wood products. You can see here in some cases, here's the clear cut, you're getting roughly half of it in the wood products. So I'm wrapping up now. So the net carbon accumulation in the forest is equal to the net primary productivity, which is the photosynthesis part, minus the loss from various in various ways, from fire and from harvest. And what you're putting back in is reforesting, afforestation, planting where there wasn't a forest to go before, reducing the harvest frequency, and proforestation. Those are the things you can do. So we need to have some land use strategies that will mitigate climate change for natural solutions. We have to have some low human impact forests. We need to expand some of our protected areas, set other areas aside for production forests, because it's when we keep all the forests at a relatively young age that we never accumulate the amount that we can if we let some of the forests continue to grow to store the most carbon. And so reducing harvest on public lands is one way of doing that. That's, after all, that's the public forests belong to the public. And some of that can be for producing forest products, but some of it might be used for these other purposes, including carbon storage. So who speaks for the trees? Well, you probably know about this guy, the Lorax. The word of the Lorax seems perfectly clear. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. But it's not just the Lorax who speaks for the trees. Climate scientists do too, if you please. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Moomaw. Let me go ahead and cancel the spotlight there, and we will pass it over to Dr. Davis. Whenever you are ready, Dr. Davis, you can set up your own screen share and take it away.
Cool. Can you still hear me?
Sure
Yes.
can.
Great. Let's make this happen. And unlike our practice run, I know exactly where the present button is. Cool. So I knew coming into this that Dr. Moomaw was going to do a most excellent job talking all about forest carbon. So please forgive me if I kind of meander between forest carbon and then a lot of what my organization, Dogwood Alliance, works on, which is the human connection to forests as well. So I work for Dogwood Alliance. We are based in Asheville, North Carolina, but we do work all over the South. We have been around just over 20 years. And we focus a lot on southern forests. And the reason that we focus on southern forests is because southern forests are called the wood basket of the world. They produce a disproportionate amount of wood products that go all over the world. And so our work focuses a lot on biomass and wood pellet production, which Dr. Moomaw did a great job covering. We speak more broadly about forestry practices in the South and across the US. And then we also turn our eyes towards conservation practices as well. I am a conservation scientist with Dogwood. I am the scientist on staff, as it were. Most of the rest of my colleagues are campaigners, so they do a lot of our actions and getting people out, out to protest, out to write letters, all those sorts of things. So backing up, just to give us the climate change 101, because it just is kind of tradition at this point with any talk we do, but I'll be brief, I promise. So climate change is happening because we are emitting lots of extra carbon into the atmosphere, right? That's what we've got. And then emissions reductions, which is how we fix climate change, have to come from a combination of phasing out fossil fuels, which is the big thing that everyone knows, increasing the efficiency of our energy intensive activities, That's basically just a way of saying that, like, if our engines become more efficient, we burn less fossil fuels. And then the big thing that I'll be focusing on and Dr. Moomaw focused on is better utilizing natural solutions through changes in land use and land management activities. And that's a red squirrel on the left. I try to put pictures in even if there's a lot of text. So, you know, you've seen a version of the carbon cycle before, I'm sure. If you haven't, basically we're kind of focused on the left side of this diagram here, and we're talking about forest carbon. So forest carbon is the carbon that is stored in the trees, the roots, the limbs, the leaves, and soils. And this carbon is stored as a result of photosynthesis, bringing it all the way back to high school biology. If we leave our forests untouched, they can safely store carbon for hundreds of years. There are lots of other natural sources of carbon storage and carbon emissions, and there's plenty of man-made ones as well. So let's talk about natural solutions. The most common benchmark I see is that scientists agree we can expect about a third of our needed reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to come from natural solutions. And natural solutions include these activities that Dr. Moomaw was talking about: afforestation, proforestation, reforestation, forest preservation. They include changes in management practices for agricultural and forest lands. I'm not going to talk about the agriculture, but that is an important part of working lands. And then also changes in how blue carbon, which is the fancy name we give to carbon storage in rivers, lakes, and oceans, is managed. So when we look at natural areas, we can expect about a third of our emissions to come from those regions. So Dr. Moomaw and I and our executive director, Dana Smith at Dogwood, all put together this report back in, I think it was late 2017, called The Great American Stand. So I have a short link down there at the bottom if folks want to click through. It's a very pretty report. I really appreciated the design as well as the research process while we were doing it. And I'm just going to share some of the infographics from there right now. So that's why I have it linked here for you. All right, so when I'm talking about the story of forests in the US, I'm talking about it all the way back to colonization. So these three maps are recreations that were done in, I believe, 1935 of the area of virgin forest in the US. And by virgin forest, the author meant basically unharvested, untouched by human hands. So in 1620, you know, like half of the eastern US was just covered in forests. And then by 1850, we're really starting to see that downward slide. And by 1926, there's barely anything left. So if you notice up here in that northern part of New York, you'll see my favorite region in the eastern US, the Adirondacks. That, by some miracle, has remained and is the largest contiguous old growth left in the eastern US. The largest in the US, I believe, is up here in the North Woods. And then down here in Appalachia, we are actually ranked number 3. So I like these maps, and I've been using these maps for a decade now, in part because of my work with the West Virginia white butterfly, which Tom mentioned. So the West Virginia white butterfly is this, brief sidetrack, apologies. It's this tiny little butterfly that's not so bright, and it has spent its life living on these host plants that only grow in places where logging does not happen. So the West Virginia white was really, really prominent and all over the place in the 1600s and even into the 1800s. But then if you look through the natural history books and papers and publications, et cetera, you'll notice that people start noting local extinction events. And these butterflies were here, but they're not there anymore. And it coincides with this deforestation that happened right around the turn of the 1900s. So we lost something like 2/3 of our forests in that time. We kind of hit our low point right around 1910 before the US government was like, hey, maybe we shouldn't cut everything down. And that's where the birth of American silviculture came. So in 1910-ish and onwards, we started replanting, but we weren't quite doing it right. We weren't replanting to make forests, we were replanting to make products, because this was the industrial age and we needed to, build all the houses, do all the things, make all the paper. Paper and pulp are the predominant harvest sources, at least here in the US South. but we use our forests for so much. And so we have this rise of industrialization, and the questions that the American silviculture energy in this country were asking were like, how can we grow these trees really fast? How can we get them super straight? How can we cut them down as quickly as possible? And how can we replant them effectively? So that mindset just led to this massive carbon deficit. I'm surprised Dr. Moomaw did not put this one in, because we do have a couple of duplicates between our PowerPoints. But so this graph shows the carbon balance, and it's kind of a confusing graph, so I'm going to walk you through it. And you might get flashbacks to calculus, and I apologize. I'm not going to actually make you do calculus. So if you remember back to my little virgin forest area map, we had all of this deforestation happening. And this graph is set up so we have year at the bottom and then carbon here. So in this graph, positive carbon, so above the 0, is bad. That means that our forests are emitting more carbon than they're storing. A carbon line below the 0 means good. Our forests are storing more than they're emitting. So we ended up having something like 250 years where our forests were emitting more than they were storing. Naturally, that means that even though we did switch and now we're storing more than we're emitting, we have this debt to make up for. And so this is the part where calculus comes in a little bit. If you remember calculus, the important thing that we do when we're measuring things like this is measuring the area under the graph. And so I can't tell you with this little infographic that I have very precisely measured it, but I can tell you that the area under this side of the graph where we were emitting carbon is much larger than the area under this part where we actually started storing again. So when you hear folks talk about like forests store carbon and it's so cool and our forests are great at storing carbon, they are. But also we have all of this carbon debt that we're just hamstrung with, and we can't even like consider our current forests as a net positive until we address this negative that happened, this massive deforestation followed by quick growing low carbon forests. So back to the quick growing low carbon forests real quick. In 1950 something, we had 0 pine plantations. We just hadn't quite figured it out yet. 1953, we were starting to pump up a little bit. Early estimates I have about 200,000 acres in the south of pine plantations in 1953. And then it has grown steadily since, by about 600,000 acres a year. And so from 1950 to 2010, we've gained about 40 million acres in the south of pine plantations. Pine plantations are monoculture forests, they're single species. Often foresters, land managers will apply pesticides or herbicides multiple times to keep other growth down. These trees screw with the water cycle. They alter biodiversity, often in a negative way. They're just kind of bad news. And so if you talk to someone in the forest industry, often they will say, well, our forests have been growing since 1950. And that is somewhat true. So we have had 40 million acres of pine plantations grow in the last 60 years, starting from 2010 is where we're ending, sorry. And simultaneously, we've lost 35 million acres of natural forests. So yes, we have gained, that's a net gain of 5 million acres of forest. Good job, US South, except that we have lost 35 million acres of natural forest and gained 40 million acres of monoculture. And so that has severely impacted the biodiversity and carbon storage potential of our forests. This is also an image of the US South forests, and this just, again, speaks to that point that our forests are very young and very monoculture. So only 7% of the forest stands in the US South are older than 80 years. Now, if I walk into a classroom with, I don't know, 8-year-olds, and I ask them, you know, how old can a tree get? Chances are that those kids are going to tell me, you know, hundreds of years. Yet, over half of our trees in the US South are less than 40 years old. You know, like over half of those trees are about the age or maybe slightly younger than those kids' parents. And that's just not how our forest should be. So the pie chart that Dr. Moomaw showed with the 85% of carbon loss being attributed to harvest. This is that same data, but it's just in map form so that you can see it. And again, I just want to point out all of this deep red in the South. This is all carbon loss. And West Virginia isn't, you know, out of the red. There's still some there, but it's very deep here in the South where we're just constantly losing carbon to harvest. And that's 5 times more than all of these other pieces. You hear people talk a lot about fire, especially in the West. And sure, if you look at this little map, there's plenty of carbon loss in the West from fire, but it is fractional compared to the carbon loss from logging, both in the West and across the US. There was actually a really cool update to this paper, but I couldn't find the map that I made, so you don't get to see it. If you're really interested, you can email me and I'll show it to you later. So all of this put together, I know I've kind of been just talking bad about our forests here in the South, but it means there's opportunity. It means there's a lot of opportunity for old growth development in the South and across the Eastern US if we can adjust our priorities. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the connections between people and forests, because even though scientists, we think we're so objective and you know, unbiased and all that, we're not. We are people, and we are people living in an ecosystem. And so we should always keep that human dimension to all of the work that we're doing. So there's a strong connection between the health of human and natural communities. And this isn't just some like thing that I'm picking up because I live in Asheville and Asheville is full of artsy people. This is a real scientific thing. We have papers to back this up. There's a landmark paper by a dude named Ulrich who found that hospital patients with a view of a tree, literally just like looking out the hospital window and seeing a tree, those people had better health outcomes than people who were in the hospital and didn't have a view of a tree as they were healing. We also see it in the other direction. So the emerald ash borer is an invasive insect that is completely wiping out our ash trees. Like 99.9% of ash trees do not survive when they are attacked by emerald ash borer. It was introduced in Michigan and has slowly trickled on down. We don't have it here yet, but it's soon. It came over in horticulture, which is a whole nother story. So the emerald ash borer has done this, and because it started in Detroit, we have this kind of before and after, right? So we know that Detroit, which was previously covered in ash trees, is no longer covered in ash trees. And there was a lot of ash tree death in that time. And so some folks like studied that, and what they found was that human mental health was actually correlated pretty strongly with the presence of dead trees. So as tree death increased, human mental health decreased. So we have this relationship with the community around us, even if we're not like surrounded by forests all the time. We also need to think about this in broader terms. So I am clearly very, very white. I kind of had that classic privileged upbringing. I was able to go to college. I was able to go to grad school. My parents, I was an only child. They were able to support me through. I never have faced any sort of discrimination, prejudice, incidents based on my skin color. In contrast, we have 400 years of creating subclasses out of folks who are not considered white. And the definition of white has also changed over the last 100 years or so. And where we can see this in natural areas is access, especially access to green spaces. So during the Jim Crow era, which was after slavery, there were actually segregated areas here on the left in our national forest and national park systems so that non-white folks could recreate separately from the white folks. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that those accommodations were not perhaps as good as the ones afforded to white people. So we have this long history of racial injustice and violence in the United States, and this really plays into both how we perceive nature and how people of all ages and races are able to interact with nature in the United States. And this is reflected even in urban areas now. So I remember an image going around during the beginning of the COVID pandemic where parks in white neighborhoods in New York City were open for kids to get away and play, even if they wear masks, yet parks in areas with high non-white populations were not. And so we still have this segregation in the United States, and it really influences who can speak for the trees and who has access to the trees. So this brings me to back to wood pellets for a bit. So Dr. Moomaw had a great overview of wood pellets. Basically, just to give you the international context here before I tell you about this picture, wood pellets to heat homes have always been around in a small amount, especially in the Northeast. That's generally not a problem. The problem with wood pellets, as we see it, is this industrialization, which Dr. Moomaw was speaking to. So basically, when the first climate change alarms were ringing, somehow wood pellets got stuck in as a potential carbon neutral, low carbon option. We now know through scientific research that this is very much not the case, and wood pellets in many instances are actually worse than coal in terms of carbon and in terms of pollution. But in the meantime, because Europe acts faster than the United States, and Europe's forests are more heavily managed and heavily regulated than the United States, we had the system set up where European demand for wood pellets has been driving the logging in southern forests here in the US. And so this really took off in about 2010, and we've had something like 40 million tons of wood pellets exported from 2010 to 2019. This is important because it plays into this issue of race in America and of our forests. So I did a study with Dr. Moomaw's, one of Dr. Moomaw's former master's students, and we found that every single wood pellet production mill in the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina, is in an environmental justice community. And an environmental justice community is a community that is high percentage non-white and high percentage poverty. So especially Eastern North Carolina, which also, may I add, is getting hit very hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Here, this is where all of the wood pellet mills are. And these wood pellet mills, mysteriously, I don't know how this could happen, are also occurring in communities that already have existing polluting industries. So Richmond County, North Carolina is one of the communities that we at Dogwood work in. And I believe they also, in this very small, like couple thousand people community, have a chicken processing plant, a train station. Is supposed to be the end point of the, I believe, the Mountain Valley Pipeline compressor station. And they have a couple more. I didn't write them down, but there are like 5 polluting industries in this very small community with high poverty and high non-white population. And you see this pattern all across the South. And the pattern gets washed out a little bit if you look at paper and pulp manufacturing, because there are just so many paper and pulp mills. But with biomass, because it's a smaller industry, you especially see it. We have this, again, this just like total injustice where these communities are not only having their forests cut down all around them, because 75 miles is the potential sourcing radius of each of these, but also they're already dealing with so much else. And these wood production plants, they produce a lot of dust. People talk about having to like wipe off their cars to leave their houses after a night of the wood pellet production plant running. They talk about constant noise 24/7. They talk about damages to the roads. Folks inside the mills and certain news articles have talked about almost like regular explosions because the wood pellet mill production process is inherently dangerous. So this is just an example, again, of environmental justice and how it relates to forests. Environmental justice isn't just the big PCB fights in the 1980s and 90s. It's also still an issue today. So shifting up a little out of wood pellets and just back towards climate change, I also want to point out that climate change is disproportionately impacting these same communities. So this photo, I actually can't remember where I got this, so I can't say it's in the South, but I can tell you that those same communities here on the eastern coast, North Carolina, have been hit by several hurricanes and massive flooding in the last few years with climate change. And with climate change, hurricanes are expected to get worse, and flooding events are expected to get worse. And so these communities that are already being polluted and having their forests cut down are now also being subjected to the side effects of having those forests cut down. So beyond the carbon, they're also just dealing with water quality. Most of the people in, I think over half of the people in North Carolina live on well water. And when you have giant flooding events like these, where the flooding can, say, impact a concentrated feeding operation for hogs, then that stuff gets into your well and you no longer have drinking water. So I just really want to flag that, these communities are taking the brunt of it, but they're not causing the brunt of it. The brunt of climate change is caused by this industrialization, of our lives, the commercialization of our lives, and the industrialization of our forests as well. So I've given you the bad news, and let's talk about making changes. So on racial environmental justice, briefly, and then I'll switch back to more traditional forest and climate pieces. There is no environmental justice without racial justice, and there's no climate change advocacy and climate change solution without environmental justice. The environmental justice movement is widely believed to have been birthed here in North Carolina, where I live right now, and that was the fight over PCB dumping, which is fascinating, and you should take some time to read about it. I'm not going to go into it here. So if you want to work on climate change, you have to also work on climate justice. And so all of these organizations, including my own, Dogwood Alliance, we all work on climate justice. So I just wanted to, put these out there. Here are places that you can go and you can engage with these organizations, and you'll be taking actions to support climate justice and climate change. The other thing you can do is be more educated. I know folks, especially white folks, tend to shy away from racial justice. They think, that's not for me. It doesn't affect me. I'm friendly with people of all races. But there are some really problematic things that we can still do as white people that are just really harmful, and we can change that. And so taking a racial justice training or a couple and just getting that perspective and beginning to understand the full racial history in this country is going to be a great way for you to be an ally with these climate justice organizations and communities and grassroots movements. And then finally, I want to flag that we should be lifting up community-led solutions and Black voices especially. So I have Mustafa Ali here on the right. He currently works with the National Wildlife Federation. He's a great voice in the climate and environmental movement. And then I also have Reverend Leah Woodbury here with Loretta Slater. And they both work heavily in North Carolina. And they're great leaders on climate and environmental justice. I'm not part of your community, wherever you're tuning in from. So I don't know who those voices are, but I'm sure a Google or a quick question on Facebook could find you an answer. And, we want to be lifting up those voices because they have been silenced for so long. All right, I'm going to switch on back to forestry here. So a lot of states right now are coming up with these climate action plans, especially here in the South. This was pretty much a direct response to President Trump pulling us out of the Paris Accords. So all of these governors got together and they're like, hey, we should make these climate action plans because if our president isn't going to do it, then we should do it. So there's a large desire from individual states to create these climate action plans. Some of these, like North Carolina's, include specific attention on natural and working lands. This is basically the natural solutions that I was referencing earlier. So North Carolina just completed our plan and released it last month. And I just wanted to reflect on that process. So we were involved in that process, and there's this big risk that did kind of happen of the same old strategies coming into play. And how your state's climate action plan goes is really dependent on how the process is set up. So I don't know yeah, I can switch slides here. So North Carolina, what happened was the governor's office decided to set up a working group in North Carolina for the natural and working lands. So there's a stakeholder group, and we got invited as Dogwood Alliance kind of last minute. And it was noticeable because of all of the organizations there, and there were many large organizations. All of those organizations are or tended to be pretty industry friendly with a few exceptions. So if you look at an organization like the Nature Conservancy, for example, and I'm not bashing any environmental organizations here, don't rat me out to other organizations or anything like that, but the Nature Conservancy is one of the largest environmental organizations in the United States, and they have a pretty conservative view of forestry. They believe that intensive forest management on lands that they own, especially, is an appropriate measure, and they believe that you can still meet forest carbon goals while intensively managing forests. And so we had a lot of those sort of traditional environmental organizations at the table. And then we also had a bunch of industry players at the table. So I'm talking like the North Carolina Forestry Association, which is a lobbying organization for the forestry industry. They were called on to come to this natural and working land stakeholder group to figure out how to fix the climate problem. And then you had Dogwood Alliance and a couple of our allies, and we are kind of a hybrid organization. So I'm the only scientist on staff. We don't hold land. We're not a land trust. We are very much a grassroots organization. We organize with the communities that we work in, especially in Eastern North Carolina, but all across the South. We work in Georgia and South Carolina and the Gulf South as well. And we push to get reforms. So just continuing here, there was a lot of business as usual, and this was calls for forest enhancement, aka increasing logging, and a total lack of discussion around the racial and environmental injustices that may come along with some of these proposed solutions. And it was unsurprising given the makeup of the stakeholder groups. So these are just things you need to watch out for as you're engaging with these climate action plans. And NC's implication for justice, I mean, we have tax incentives designed to reward landowners. We have forestry programs, which, if implemented incorrectly, could worsen environmental injustices. There were calls for increased extraction from forests. There were calls for using concentrating feeding operations to produce biogas without acknowledging the local impacts. There was also some good stuff in the plan. There was a call to restore millions of acres of forests and wetlands as well. So, you know, just keep in mind that when you're working from the inside, it can be really challenging to get everything you want. The tactic that we at Dogwood prefer is actually working from the outside with advocacy-driven change. So knowledge is power, and a lot of times our elected officials don't always know the narrative that we want to tell them. If you're talking to your elected official about climate change, it could be the first time that they're hearing about it from a person with your background. And so keeping that in mind can really help you get your point across. So when you're talking to people, they want easy solutions. You want to give them a quick background. You want to tell them the problem. You want to tell them why what's going on isn't currently working. And you want to give them a solution. You want to say how we can fix it. And politicians are always looking for those concrete details of do this and this will happen. And so we also want to provide an action for them to take right now to fix it. So I've been doing this with Dogwood through storytelling with data. We have a tool that I've created here, the Carbon Index Project. And it's basically just calculating forest carbon, which is the tons of carbon in forest by the acres. And you've seen versions of this in Dr. Moomaw's presentation. So we did this over the summer, and these are just some graphs from North Carolina. So most of our forests are these oak, gum, cypress, which is wetland forest, and oak hickory, over half of our forests together. And that's also where most of our carbon is stored. You can also find out about stand origin, which is whether or not it's a plantation or natural. And you can see that across North Carolina, all of our natural forests, which are these dark green, have higher carbon than plantations. So just supporting that point that I made earlier about plantations not being true forests. And you'll notice too in this program, I have sentences like, if those acres had been naturally generated, they would be storing this much more carbon. So really trying to make it concrete for folks. So we have this system now, which I've been building, that will tell the story about forest carbon for any state that we have the data for, which I do not have West Virginia right now, but I'm hopeful to get it in there soon. And then we have little bits of narrative around those where we can just tell the story about forest carbon and why it matters and why forest age matters. As forests age, they accumulate more carbon, et cetera, et cetera. Some folks might just not know that. And so we have, Dr. Moomaw showed a similar piece here to this, but this is just carbon by age class, and you'll see that, unsurprisingly, it goes up. Young trees only store this much, and old trees store this much. So people in power need answers, and creating tools is an easy way to make that happen. We can rely on professionals, you know, and this is like reaching out to organizations like mine or other organizations. Being unified is also important. So like if someone has the language out there, just use their language. It's easy. That climate emergency piece that Dr. Moomaw has, that's great. We use climate emergency all the time. Everyone knows what we mean. It seems to be a unified call. And then the last thing we want to do is stand up and just call out injustices when you see them. So to wrap up, our future forests should be older. They should be biodiverse. They should be higher carbon than they are right now. They should be open for recreation, and they should be open to everyone. And then I just have an action link here. If folks want to take action, we have a new action calling on the federal government to think about forests as we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis and Dr. Moomaw, for those wonderful presentations. Well, right now we're going to open it up for questions. We already have a lot of questions coming in, and we are trying to wrap this up probably in the next 15, 20 minutes. But first, I will just encourage you all, you can submit questions in through that Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We already got a lot coming in, so apologies if we don't get all of them, but we can follow up via email and stuff after the fact. But to kick us off here, I'm going to bring in Brittany Patterson from West Virginia Public Broadcasting, and she will kick it off with some questions from here for both Drs. Moomaw and Davis. So let me bring her in as a panelist here and make sure that that works. Should be just a minute here. Here comes Brittany. There we are. How you doing, Brittany?
Doing well. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you're sounding great. Thank you so much. And yeah, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. And those were, thanks to both of our presenters, those were really amazing and in-depth presentations. You're making my job hard here. But one thing I wanted to sort of start with is, you know, we might have all forgotten because of a global pandemic, but we are in an election year. And I'm wondering if either one of you are hearing about the role that forests can play being spotlit in some of the climate plans that we might be seeing from our candidates.
Sam, do you want to answer that from your end? I'll talk about it up here.
Sure. So we're not seeing too much, honestly, right now about forests. It's like every other article. Like today, I saw an article about the North Carolina State Fair being canceled. Of course, it's canceled. There's a pandemic, guys. Does it need to be a headline? So I think, unfortunately, a lot of discussion about climate action plans and forests and carbon and the important role that they play are just getting washed out right now. You know, it's not okay, but it is what it is.
It's problematic. The Democratic Party in the House put out a big climate plan, I don't know, 700 pages long or something, 500 pages long, whatever it is. And unfortunately, the part they have about forest seems to have been written by the forestry industry rather than by any climate scientist. And I've had conversations now with more than a dozen congressional staff because we wrote them to them as scientists, and It turns out in all the hearings, they've never had a single scientist who was a climate scientist or a forest ecologist testify. They did have the Nature Conservancy, but they did not have any independent scientists testifying. So that's a problem. We're trying to fix that a group of us put together a letter. We got 200 scientists to sign it and sent it to the Congress, and that's gotten us at least an opportunity to talk to some of the staff and occasionally to members of Congress. So we're trying to reach out as scientists to let them know that, you know, what they're saying is going to happen is not going to happen if they're doing it that way.
Yeah, well, thank you both. I think maybe one type of solution that people might have heard when it comes to forests is this idea of carbon markets, either through the California Forest Carbon Market or through REDD+. And I'm wondering, you know, what is the role that you think markets can play in preserving forests? And are we seeing any examples of it taking off at this point?
There is a role, but we want us to be very careful. There's a lot of gaming of the system that's possible with carbon markets. It was the one thing that led to the collapse of the climate negotiations, because Brazil wanted to both sell to rich countries protecting forests and then take credit for it as well, get double credit, and other countries didn't agree. The California market's pretty good. If you get paid by the California market not to cut your forest, it's 100 years commitment. And I don't know how they're going to enforce that in 100 years, but but at least it's in there. At least it's in the contract. I think that basically it's so important to be absorbing carbon and accumulating carbon from the atmosphere that we should have a system where people who agree to do that get paid to do that. I mean, I, as a member of society, am benefiting by their doing that. I'd be willing to pay a tax on something for that to happen. But that doesn't seem to be on the table, but I think it should be. And because many times in New England, there are a lot of smaller landowners, less than 100 acres, less than 10 acres. And at some point, there's an illness in the family, there's a child who needs to go to college, and so they have to sell it off and cut it. If they could be paid that same amount for keeping it standing, they never get very much for it, right? It's pretty. The owners don't get very much money, and then public lands like national forests and state forests often literally financially undercut private landowners by selling wood from the public forest at a much lower cost. So I think there are things we could do to change that situation and have a system where we're not using them as offsets, by the way, because with offsets you're still emitting carbon dioxide from the fossil fuels. This needs to be treated as though it's a true reduction, but you still have to reduce your emissions as well. So we need to get a twofer here.
Just to pop in with my own perspective, which is a little bit different. Just on the racial and environmental justice piece, something like less than 1% of Black folk in the South are landowners / forest family landowners. And if you think about the history of injustice in the US, the people that are holding lands are, generally white and old, and in the South are probably former slaveholding families. And so when we have these systems that reward large landowners, which carbon markets in practice currently do reward large landowners, it takes about 1,500 acres, owning about 1,500 acres for a carbon market to be profitable for you. We just have this system where the rich are getting richer. There are some other concerns too, especially around REDD. I know Indigenous Environmental Network and other organizations have come out pointing out that oftentimes these countries will sweep into indigenously managed land and just kind of put a fence around it and call it set aside for carbon market, whereas the indigenous people were living on and managing and taking from that land for thousands of years prior. So there are a lot of issues with carbon markets, and I think although the points that Dr. Moomaw made around if we're not using them as a permission to pollute, and we are using them for payments. And if there was a way to address the equity, I think that they could be a really good tool. I don't think they're the worst tool out there, but we at Dogwood certainly don't like push carbon markets as a solution for these kind of complex reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask one more and then I'll turn it back over to our organizers here. You know, you talked a lot about how we've lost a lot of forest here in the United States. And, you know, anyone who lives here in West Virginia will look at our forests and see beautiful forests, but also know that that's been clear cut once, maybe more, throughout most of the state. And so I guess, you know, quite frankly, like our forest good? How could we here in a state that has got forests but has seen loss of a lot of that old growth, what practices could we implement, or what could we do in order to boost our carbon storage and be more climate resilient?
Well, I would say, I mean, that's the idea behind proforestation. These secondary forests are regrowing, and many of them are at an age where they are accumulating carbon very rapidly, and they will be doing so for the next 100 or 150 years. And more importantly, they'll be doing it in the next decade, when we really have to be reducing our net contribution to the atmosphere. So again, anything we could do to encourage that continuing is important. And so one of the problems with, say, burning wood and then saying it's carbon neutral because a forest grows back is that forest doesn't grow back until it's for the time period when we need it to be growing back. And during that time, there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that means that the earth is warmer, and that means a glacier melts somewhere and the sea level rises. And when the trees grow back, that glacier doesn't refreeze, right? So these are irreversible changes. So the less we do now, the better off we are in terms of meeting these goals. And our secondary forests, by the way, if we allowed all the secondary forests in the world to regrow, we come very close to closing the gap between emissions, today's emissions, and removal rates over the next 50 to 100 years. But we won't do that. We will keep harvesting some of them and so on. But the point is, the potential is enormous, and they really have accumulated only half of what they're capable. So even if we only do half of what we ought to do, we're still going to be getting a quarter more than we're already getting. And so, I mean, we should thank, have you thanked a tree today for what it's done to remove carbon dioxide and helping us not see the increase the increase is less than half of what we're putting in. The oceans and the forests, they're our friends. We need to do a better job of protecting them.
Dr. Moomaw, since you took it there, really quickly, I'd love for you both to share what your favorite tree species is. I found that tree scientists are the most involved in their studies. So I'm curious, if you had to pick one, what might you pick?
I'm a great fan of both red oak and white oak. I just think they're magnificent trees, and they are. I have a red oak on my property that's 13 feet in circumference. Why it's still here, I don't know, because this was a poor rocky farm area that was abandoned because they couldn't make it as farmers. So I don't feel like I've destroyed any agricultural land or any forest land. But those trees are here, and I just feel it's a privilege that I'm responsible for their continuing to be here, and they're just incredible.
For me, I'm going to actually go back to my childhood. So I was born in Western New York, not New York City, the rest of the state. Not bitter about that at all. And I would say my favorites are the birch and the sycamore. They're the ones with the funky bark. So birch gets really white bark, and then sycamore gets this cool multi-patterned bark.
Well, thank you both for indulging me. I guess I'll turn it back over to Tom and Colin, because I know we have a lot of questions coming in.
Indeed we do. Indeed we do. Thanks a lot, Brittany. I'm going to kick you back down to an attendee. And let's We'll take about 15 minutes here to do these. I think that's okay, right, Tom? I know we're wanting to wrap things up, but we do have a lot of questions coming in here, so I want to make sure we have as much time to answer as many as we can. So I'll start with this one that I think Dr. Moomaw marked as something he wanted to answer live. So we'll start with that one, and then we'll pick these ones as well. Evan asks, why isn't it carbon neutral to burn wood if it's grown?
Well, here's the thing. It may be carbon neutral if you cut a 100-year-old forest, it will take 100 years at best for it to regrow. So the benefit is far in the future. Economists always tell us that any benefit in the future is worth less than the benefit today. So the benefit today is what you get from burning it. The benefit of regrowing it is far into the future. And as I said, even if you ever reach that, and there's no guarantee we will, obviously, but let's assume everything worked perfectly and you got there. It still turns out that it may have been better to burn coal and let the forest continue growing in terms of the total amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. I mean, that's really how bad it is. And when the trees grow, even if it's carbon neutral, it's not climate neutral. The climate has been irreversibly changed.
Wow, thanks, Dr. Moomaw.
Well, and carbon neutral is not good enough, right? We need to have removal rates exceed what we put in, which means we reduce what we're putting in and increase what's taking it out. Because otherwise, let's suppose we got carbon neutral today. How do you like the climate we have right now? We'd be stuck with that. Oh no, we wouldn't. It would be worse because we're already seeing irreversible feedback loops, thawing in the permafrost in the Arctic that is releasing more greenhouse gases. So it's going to get even warmer, even if we stop everything today. That's why we have to be removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's why it's really an emergency, because if these natural systems start feeding back, we're in very serious trouble.
Thanks, Dr. Moomaw. Let's see. Perry asks, what role, if any, do you see for carbon capture and sequestration and carbon capture and utilization? Sorry if I butchered any of those words there.
I'm sure we both have pretty strong opinions on this. So here's what I'll say to keep it short so we can get to other questions. Carbon capture and sequestration, carbon capture and storage are good in theory, but we have yet to see an industrial scale effective implementation of that is better than the benchmark of just growing some trees.
I would agree with that. I mean, fine, let them see if they can find it. If they find it, wonderful. But then let's not let that get in the way of getting more carbon accumulation by natural systems.
Perfect. Thank you both. Let's see. The next one we've got here is, do prairies trap carbon effectively?
The answer is yes. And one of the reasons they do is because they're the largest area system in the world. They don't do very much per acre, but there are a lot of acres. And if we look at how much, say in the Midwest, if you go to Iowa, you'll find churches sitting up on platforms of land that are maybe 6 to 10 feet above the surrounding area. That's because all that carbon soil has been lost through agriculture. If we could put all that carbon back, that would be a lot of carbon stored.
Gotcha. Thank you, Dr. Moomaw. Let's see here. What else we got? We've got people asking if the slides and sources will be available after the presentation. Dr. Davis, I know we've got yours on Google. Are you okay with us sending that out to the attendees?
Yeah,
Yep.
I'll send you mine too.
Okay, perfect. We will send out links to those after the event. And then there's also people who have been asking if there's going to be a recording. And yes, there will be. So we will also send out that YouTube link, if not tomorrow, then Friday, to everybody who's attended here and anybody who couldn't join. So let's do a couple more questions here before we let everybody go. Let's see, the next one that I am seeing here is a little bit more specific. Not sure if y'all are going to have specific answers for this, but Leslie wants to know, what do we do about neighborhoods cutting down 80 to 90-year-old oak trees out of fear or for human convenience? Tree ordinances? I know it's not a huge forest, but if there are mature trees in neighborhoods, shouldn't those be protected too?
So,
why would they do that? Sam, let them have it.
well, so at Dogwood, as our conservation scientist, we have a contact form, and I get contacts every couple months. I get 2 or 3 a year, and I get a similar question. And the unfortunate answer is that for the most part, private property is private property, and they can do what they want with their trees. Period. So mostly, I get it actually for development reasons. Around here in Asheville, people are cutting to put up their next fancy hotel that rich people are going to come visit us in. But certainly those neighborhood trees are also important. And yeah, the best thing you can do, honestly, is make some noise about it. Get involved with your city council. You can try to become like a tree city. I know that's a program that exists that does try to preserve neighborhood trees and whatnot. But short of convincing them personally not to cut down those trees, you're kind of on your own unless you buy all the property. And even then, if they're getting cut for right-of-ways for electric companies, there's not much you can do. So it's not a good answer, but it's the reality of the situation.
Urban trees are very good also in cooling the surrounding area through the evaporation of water. So in addition to the carbon storage, however much or little that might be. And then there's other fascinating things. Neighborhoods that have more trees have less crime. And it's not just income. This is true regardless of income level. So it's not just that, you correct for everything. More trees, people live better, and it's a more civil society, which is good.
Great. Let's see. Aaron asks Dr. Moomaw, do you recommend any studies we can share in regards to thinning versus fire and forest carbon loss?
Yes, somebody else asked if I could make references available. I can put together a short list, and I'm sure Dr. Davis could as well, that you could then share with people afterwards. I mean, it would take me a little, I don't know, half an hour maybe to put that together and send it. I'll do it later this evening.
Well, that would be incredible. I'm sure this person and everyone else who has asked similar questions would appreciate that. So thank you.
You can post them on your website somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We'll share them far and wide. If you want to take the time to do that, we would appreciate it. Thank you so much. Let's do a couple more. I got an email from somebody, got a couple emails. Someone wanted to get comments on a paper that I don't think we're going to have time. Sorry, Bernie, I don't think we're going to have time to get into that. But someone emailed to ask a specific question. They weren't able to log into the webinar due to technical reasons, but they said, what's the best approach to dealing with an entrenched bureaucracy in a state-level Department of Forestry that refuses to acknowledge the fact of global climate destabilization?
I got opinions on this one too. So the last part of my presentation that I kind of fast forwarded through was addressing North Carolina's particular problem in this area specifically. The thing that I like to keep in mind is that forestry in America was built to grow and cut trees. Forestry in America is not conservation and ecological science in America. And as long as you have that framework in mind, you can work around these people. So, like the things that appeal to forestry-minded people is like a lot of caveating what you're saying. Like, well, can't we just set aside a portion of trees for conservation? Or minimizing, that's not a great technique as I'm saying it, but like saying, well, I personally don't want to stop cutting every tree in America. I mean, a small part of me kind of does, but functionally that's not going to work. So, you kind of come in with a compromise, and then if that doesn't work, you hit them with the papers and more. There are tons of papers on why older trees are good, why cutting trees are bad. And the court of public opinion is always going to be on the cutting trees is bad side. So, that's kind of how I deal with it.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I work closely with scientists like Sam Davis and others who are at universities and as I said, even at schools of forestry, who basically are they believe in in doing it honestly, and they come up with their numbers, and we've been able to make some progress on that. And then we need a receptive public that is willing to reference this when they go and engage. After all, I think we're still a democracy, which means anybody in society has an equal voice. And we're seeing up here, I mean, we have there's a group of environmentalists put out a petition to suspend harvesting on state forests, not to ban it, but to harvest it until we can get a good discussion going on this. And they had 5,000 signatures already, and they just started a few months ago. I think the governor might begin to listen to those kinds of numbers. So I mean, they do make a difference. So engagement is really important, and informed engagement is even better.
Perfect. Thank you both. Let's do a few more, just 2 or 3 more here, and then we'll wrap up. We got one saying, greetings, Dr. Moomaw, from your former student. This is from Sarah. If we can be successful in reducing harvesting in the U.S., how can we prevent our demand for wood products from being shifted to the Amazon and Congo basins? Is there some equivalent to the fossil carbon pricing for wood products? Thanks for your work.
Hi, Sarah. Good to hear from you. I hope we can connect after this. It's a good question, and it's often raised. There are 2 things. One, we are already responsible for a major amount of forest clearing in the tropics. Everything we buy that has palm oil in it, that's all been forest cleared in Southeast Asia and increasingly in Latin America. A lot of the beef we buy is coming from Brazil. A lot of other things, foods we buy that are related to soy are coming from, or sugar, come from the clearing of forests in Brazil and increasingly in Central America. And the other, in terms of the wood substitution issue, there are very few woods from the tropics that are substitutes for the woods that we use in our own operations here in the United States. And the other thing I would say is I can control, or I have the opportunity to control what is done in my country. And I can work with people in other countries to help them there, but they get to make their own decisions. And there's a lot of opposition to what's going on in Brazil. There's just an article about what a large fraction of the beef we import and the other goods we import from Brazil come from illegally harvested lands in Brazil. Well, we can work to stop that, because we have a law that says we're not allowed to import things that involve illegal deforestation. There's a law that's been in effect for a long time. It was just extended to cover more things. I think that's often used as an argument, but I think it's a bit of I really don't buy the premise of the argument that we'll immediately start importing a lot of wooden things elsewhere. The problem right now is the demand for wood products has declined in North America. We don't use as much paper. There are a lot of substitutes for wood in building, construction, and so the industry is looking for alternatives, and that's where the bioenergy thing comes in, and that's where the cross-laminated timber and other arguments about building more with wood are coming from. And maybe we don't need to be doing as much. I mean, one of the reasons that we've seen a decrease in deforestation is because there's been less demand for wood in the United States. So it's like everything, it's like energy. If we use less of it, it's less of a problem.
And just for people who are more interested in that, that concept is called leakage. So if you need to, if you want to do more research on it, it's called leakage. It's not a great name, but that is what it is.
Yeah. It's not a zero problem, but I think it's not the size problem that some people make it out to be.
Great, thank you both. We'll just do two more questions here. Aaron asks a two-part question here. How is forest carbon storage determined? He wants to know if it's mostly wood volume or if it's soil carbon included. And then a follow-up to that is, likewise, any studies in regards to how quickly old growth soil carbon regenerates? And he thanks you both.
That's yours.
Oh, nice. So measuring forest carbon is actually this like really complex, tricky thing. So there are two basic ways. You can go with the top-down or bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach, you're looking at like satellite maps and LiDAR and those sort of like radar technologies to kind of get an estimate. And all of these forest carbon measurements are estimates. They're models, they're estimates. They all have varying degrees of accuracy. The other way that you can do it is the bottom-up approach. And so that's the approach we see taken by the Forest Service. And so the Forest Service has this big old program that's been around since the 1950s called the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, FIA. And what they have is they have a series of permanent forest plots scattered all across the US. The locations are private. Sometimes they're on private land, sometimes they're on public land. And they track these specific forest plots through time. And then using the information from those forest plots, they estimate up. And so with data like that, where you're going bottom up, the larger scale is going to be a little bit more accurate than the local scale. So like if I look at county forest carbon estimates, they're not going to be super accurate, but that's the type of Forest Service data that we get. So they measure forest carbon in that bottom-up system mostly, from what I understand in talking to Forest Service professionals, they do actually account for soil carbon as well as carbon in downed woody material and in the live trees. But their methodology is always updating and progressing. With every couple of years, they come out with something new. It's all kind of a needle in a haystack if we're being completely honest about it, but hopefully our estimates are getting more accurate with time. And then on old growth soils, I think the answer is that it takes a very long time to get the old growth soil characteristics. And it takes a very long time to get old growth characteristics back. Some foresters believe in manipulating the forest a little bit, doing like very small cuts to create that structural complexity that old growth forests have with downed woody material. But even that, like we can mimic it, but we're not going to get back to where we want to be until several hundred years down the road.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Let's do this as the last question here. Sorry for everybody who submitted them. We're not going to get to them, but we just got to wrap up here. But we'll wrap up with this question from Randy. How do you counter the young forest initiative people who want to cut mature forests?
I will take that since Dr. Moomaw is busy. You know, I think we just point to so certainly Dr. Moomaw and I point to those studies that we brought up. He actually cited them. I just kind of talked about them because I'm lazy and I don't like to put citations in PowerPoints. But, you know, we like, there is science to support it. There's science to back up what we're saying. And, you know, we do need a small percentage of young forests. I'm not saying that no forests ever should be young. But our view of the percentage of young forests just differs very dramatically with the young forest people. And I think a lot of the young forest people are coming from forestry backgrounds and just kind of like taking that ethos of trying to find a way to cut more forests down. So yeah, it's hard when folks' minds are made up, and you can either try to address it or try to work around them.
There's one, I agree with that. There's just one question here. I think it's important. It says, in the time frame that matters now, isn't it the rate of carbon removal rather than total sequestration that matters? And the answer is, it's the total sequestration that matters, or really it's the accumulation that matters. So how much is accumulated in the forest? And that takes into account both what is in the older forest that should not be taken out, and what is coming into the forest from the trees, the younger trees that are growing as a pro-forestation management strategy, because it's the amount that's in the forests that's not in the atmosphere. That's the important thing. And the accumulation will be greater if we let some of our forests grow and protect those that are already quite old. So it's that combination that's important.
Great. Well, thank you. We snuck a twofer in there as the last two questions. Perfect. Is there any else in there that you'd like to do
No,
before
that's
we
fine.
wrap up?
That's such an important point. I just wanted to get it across.
Oh, for sure.
It's a really good question, and there's a lot of confusion over it for understandable reasons.
For sure. Well, thanks for catching that. I did not see that in there. Well, I think that concludes it. I want to thank Dr. Moomaw and Dr. Davis. And Tom, if you want to jump back in and have any closing remarks, or are you all good? He's good, I think. That's okay. You're unmuted now. What's up, Tom?
I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us tonight, and to these speakers. I mean, I had wonderful hopes that we could get into this great topic, almost 2 years ago, and it's wonderful to see it come to fruition. And I see that I didn't realize this. We're not experts in this Zoom webinar world, and God knows if I ever want to become such an expert, but we really held the attention of 58 participants who gave up some of their really valuable time to learn about this important topic. And it's really been very, I'm delighted that we've been able to get into it in such detail and depth, and to bring these two real experts, very candid and learned people. Thank you so much for attending, and let's all give our audience a hand for participating too. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Bill Moomaw. Thanks, Don.
Yes. Well, Dr. Moomaw, Dr. Davis, anything y'all want to promote or say before we log off here?
Nope.
My email is very easy. If you want to chat to me later, it is sam@dogwoodalliance.org. I am always happy to answer questions or argue if you are argumentative, but nicely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both again for presenting. It was a wonderful presentation. And yeah, I think, like Tom said, I think 58 was a very conservative number, because at the height of the presentations, we were definitely above 100. So thank you both for a well-attended, well-received webinar. If y'all have any interest in finding out more about Friends of Blackwater or West Virginia Center on Climate Change, feel free to visit our websites at saveblackwater.org and wvclimate.org, respectively. Thanks again for attending, everybody, and stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.
Night.
Bye.